After the bombardment of Fort Sumter, North and South scrambled to prepare for war. They organized their fighting men into companies, batteries, regiments, brigades, divisions, corps, and at the highest level, they organized them into armies. An army was a term for a distinct military unit that consisted of elements of all three arms of service: infantry, cavalry, and artillery. They were usually large, numbering in the tens of thousands, but this was not always the case. What truly made them special was their independence of action. The president and the general-in-chief would issue broad missions to their army commanders, things like capture Richmond, defend Vicksburg, strike them a blow. Things that had a lot of room for interpretation, would require months of planning, maneuver, and battle across vast stretches of territory, and it was really the personality of the army commanders, the culture of the armies, and the distinct characteristics of the regions in which they were operating that made the difference when it came time to choose from this vast array of options available to them, and you see the personalities really start to shape the course of the Civil War. The main Union Army operating in the East was the Army of the Potomac, the largest Union Army, sometimes containing as many as 125,000 men, and after demoralizing defeats at Manassas, Fredericksburg, and Chancellorsville, the common soldiers of the Army felt as if their valorous conduct had not been matched by capable leadership. But this changed in 1863 when George Gordon Meade led the Army to a victory here at Gettysburg. Ulysses S. Grant would later join the Army in the field as General-in-Chief, and they would embark on the campaign that would all but end the war at Richmond, Petersburg, and Appomattox, Virginia. They were opposed by Robert E. Lee's Army in Northern Virginia, winning many battles despite almost always being outnumbered and outgunned. Robert E. Lee was a commander, an aggressive man who scoffed often at military doctrine. He was served by subordinates, men like Jackson, Stewart, and Early that were really cut from the same cloth. And they were able to hold out for quite some time before finally attrition in the officer corps and in the line soldier led to the Army being surrounded, overwhelmed, and forced to surrender to the Army of the Potomac. Now, many people think that these two armies in Virginia were the only armies of the war, but in fact, there were approximately 28 armies engaged at various times over the course of the conflict. Sometimes they would merge or divide, sometimes they'd be knocked out quickly. Some were in the field for almost the entire war. In the West, there were several Union armies operating. The Army of the Ohio, later dubbed the Army of the Cumberland, was responsible for the successful defense and successful conquest of Middle Tennessee. They won battles at Perryville, Stones River, withstood a siege at Chattanooga, then took part in the March to the Sea and across the Carolinas to close out the war in the West. The two primary Southern armies in the theater were the Army of Mississippi and the Army of Tennessee. The Army of Tennessee lost at Shiloh, lost at Perryville, lost at Chattanooga. It was very difficult for them to find victory. It was the same for the Army of Mississippi that tried and failed to defend the city of Vicksburg, Mississippi in 1863. That army would later be incorporated into the Army of Tennessee and would share in its final destruction at Franklin and Nashville in 1864. In the Trans-Mississippi Theater, across the Mississippi River, you had smaller armies much further removed from the Eastern Command Centers. They were often allied with Native American tribes, and they were possessed of somewhat eccentric strategic objectives. You had armies like the Confederate Army of New Mexico that tried to capture California and open a trade route to the Pacific. You had the Union Army of the Gulf that tried to launch offensive campaigns into Texas to show French Mexico that Lincoln meant business. You can't assess the Civil War just in terms of thousands of soldiers, tons of pork and coffee, miles of railroad track. No, human nerve and human folly have to be considered as well. The armies of the Civil War were driven to actions by the passions, strengths, ideas, and shortcomings of the men within them.